So the first session has to be thrilling, isn't it? And thrillers do keep you at the edge of your seats. So do check the durability of the chairs you're sitting on as we are ready for Vikram Chandra to take the stage for our very first Red Couch session, BLF 2022. All yours.
So thank you all for being here this Saturday morning. Thank you, of course, to the LitFest for having us. Welcome, Vikram. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So broadly speaking, so since we only have half an hour, we're going to try and keep this as tight as we possibly can. So Vikram and I will chat for about 20 minutes, and hopefully you'll have about 10 minutes for you all to come up with questions. So I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit of how I actually started reading Vikram's work. By far, my favorite work of his is Red Earth, Pouring Rain, partially also because a reference to a Sangam period poem, which I am very interested in. Because I work on an art history encyclopedia, I was wondering about what modern Indian literature would look like, a literature that's profoundly grounded in Indian history and cultural ideas, but nevertheless speaks to modern sensibilities. And I was so struck by the way that Red Earth and Pouring Rain is framed with this monkey who's injured, who turns out to be the god Hanuman, who then is interacting with the protagonist and taking him through this series of like wonderfully crafted stories. And I think that's a recurring theme of your work, Vikram, is that very often there are layers upon layers of stories that engage with so many different themes that take us through so many different places, both in time and in space. So to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about what inspires you? How do you decide to write about things like this?
I guess I'll start with specifics. So the time that I started writing Red Earth and Pouring Rain came from discovering a book in the library at Columbia University. So I was there at film school, and during that time was figuring out that I was not built for the film industry. So I used to spend a lot of time in the library. And on one of the top floors, which had a lot of books about Indian history, I looked up and saw two leather-bound books, 2 volumes that I brought down, and they turned out to be the autobiography, the translated autobiography of an British, how would you describe it?
British Indian?
British Indian soldier named Colonel James Skinner, Sikandar Skinner, who founded this very famous regiment called Skinner's Horse, which later became an armored regiment. And is it still around?
It's still around.
There. Yeah. So, you know, and it had been published, I think, in 18 something. The pages were really brittle, and I don't think it had been checked out for 60 years. So they let me take it home, and I started reading it. And Skinner's life was insane. It was incredible, right? So he's one of the first products of that encounter with the colonial powers in India and Indian culture and Indian people. His mother was a Rajput princess who was literally captured by his British father in a siege, right? And so he and his brothers and sisters had this very kind of life that mixed up life, right? Like between two worlds, that in some ways really was damaging, right? Because they didn't belong on either side completely. So I went, and then I read the whole 2 volumes, and obviously it wasn't going to be a film, right? Or at least in the way that I was going to imagine it, with epic battles. And you know, I pretty early knew that Hanuman and Ganesh were going to show up in the story, so that would need, I don't know, animation or something. And so I decided I was going to write a novel about this. And precisely the same question came to me: how do you tell a story like this within the context of colonialism, right? So that you know, when I start writing, these things come to me, and often this kind of rational analysis is post-game, right? Or somewhere in the middle. So I started writing it, and then the layers and stories within stories started appearing. One of the protagonists, Sanjay, is he's a monkey sitting at a typewriter. Again, you know, animation maybe. and his stories seem to slide into other stories told by other people within the first story naturally. And so, yeah, it just like became that. And then looking back, I can also see that I used to listen to stories, especially from the Mahabharata when I was a kid, told to me by my mother and aunts before I could read. And that structure, those narratives are structured in essentially this way, right?
Exactly. That's what I find so striking is that I happened to be reading Red Earth Pouring Rain at the same time I was reading the Katha Sarita Sagara, which is this beautiful compilation of 11th century stories. I think it was compiled in Kashmir. And it has exactly the same structure as a lot of Vikram's work, where, of course, there is this inciting incident and this overall narrative frame, but within that, there will be somebody who's telling somebody else a story, and somebody within that story will probably be telling somebody else a story. And then it just becomes this very deeply, I don't really know how to describe it, but there is something so organic about it. It feels like you're entering this tapestry that leads you seamlessly to more and more tapestries. I'm curious also, Vikram, about like how deeply you are inspired very clearly by Indian mythology, Indian history. First of all, more than what you've just told us. So you've told us in the context of Red Earth and Pouring Rain, but more generally also, how do you feel that history has inspired and informs your work? And depending on how, and this is completely up to you whether you want to answer, but how do you think about the way that history is being used in narratives today?
Right. Well, I mean, I've been an avid reader of history again from childhood, right? And of course, also because when narrative history for the general reader is done well, it's really exciting, right? And you also know that these are real people, so there's a bite to it that fiction tries to get, but I mean, it's really powerful. And but so it also informs my work, obviously with Red Earth and Pouring Rain, that if I'm going to write about Sikandar Skinner, then I need to understand the environment that he's born in, that he grows up in. So then I go into these research rabbit holes, as you know. I mean, how I met him was I discovered, I think on Twitter, that his book, Lords of the Deccan, was going to be published, and we have a common publisher. So I emailed her, and then he got in touch, and I started picking his brain. I started asking him questions, and he was kind enough to answer, right? And then I have to say that maybe I get obsessive about it because like these research rabbit holes lead you to one thing, and then in a footnote you read something that sounds really interesting that you then start reading. And often I think I'm doing this as also an excuse to actually avoid doing the writing itself.
I can relate to that.
And then it informs the whole thing, right? Even if I end up not using something that I discovered, I feel like it is like still there in a subterranean way. And then the other thing is, if you're going to write, for instance, about palace intrigue, what better way to get ideas than to read about actual palace intrigue, right? And so as a wellspring for fiction, as a resource, I think all of this is incredibly useful, right? And as to your question about the uses of history, I mean, history is always political, right? No matter who writes it and when they write it, the story that you choose to tell contains values, it contains ways of looking at the past that makes it inherently political, right? And sometimes I hear this phrase, objective history. Well, I don't think there is such a thing, right? As well as there's no innocent fiction, right? Fiction is also very political. If you read a romance novel or watch a rom-com, there's certain ideas of how men and women or other people behave that is presented as normative, right? And that is inherently political. What right now is really upsetting to me is the ugly use of history by avoiding the complexities of actual history, right? So this binary, those our people were good, that other side was evil, and often this is based completely on fantasy, right? Like not just like erroneous, like kind of resourceless historical information, or like somebody makes an honest mistake. this is just like fantasy. Like WhatsApp University, I think, is pernicious and it's evil, right? And I think it's a way of causing this ugliness that we see in current day India, in the current day United States, where there's these polarized cultures, right? Which is, I think, teetering on the edge of violence, right? And I don't mean the violence that is already happening, but large-scale violence edging towards genocide. Right. What I think is also, my older daughter is in 9th grade in school, and I went, that first, like, come meet the teacher school, and her history teacher said, and I'm quoting almost literally, we don't teach history here, we teach how to do history. And that blew my mind, right? They're teaching historiography in 9th grade, which is, I think, a desperate need of our time. Right? So sorry, I'm going on and on about this.
No, I think that's a very important point. And this idea that historiography is something that needs to be engaged with only in academic context, I think is a very simplistic way of looking at it, because I think that what your books actually do very well is engage with historiography from the perspective of narrative and storytelling. And I think that that's something that's very important, because history does not need to be this abstract, dusty thing that lives only in archives. It is a living, breathing force around us in our politics, of course, but also in the very way that we see ourselves. And I think that's one thing that I particularly enjoy about both Red Earth's Pouring Rain and Sacred Games, is that these are people who are living in history, but they don't act like they're living in history. And I think that's crucial, right? Very often when we think about people in the past, I mean, we don't think that we are living in the past. We don't think that we're living in history. But somebody is going to write a history of the 21st century 100 years from now, and they're going to look back, and what do you think they're going to think about us?
They're I mean, it's too harsh and ugly right now to think in that way, but they're going to think we are absolutely nuts, right? And somebody's going to write satire about this, right? And sometimes satire is the only way you have of dealing with this ugliness, right? Black humor.
So, I mean, of course, I do have more questions on this line of thought, but I'd like to also, before we get into that, I'd like to discuss a little bit about your research methods. So, I mean, you have talked about going into rabbit holes, of course, but is there more than that? Is there a method to the madness? Because one thing that also strikes me, especially about Sacred Games, is that the way you write about lived spaces is with this profound humanity. It's like you have lived in these homes, you've turned the pages on the calendars, like you've prayed at the altars almost. How do you go about researching? And I'm sure that a lot of these stories are also inspired by interactions you have with real people, just as history inspires you. How do real people, real spaces inform you and the way you write?
So again, maybe dealing with specifics will help. So the way I started writing Sacred Games was that I was living in Bombay, and we've lived in Bombay for a long time, since the late 70s. But we saw the change in crime, right? So instead of a cottage industry kind of thing with local dadas in your neighborhood, it became a corporate affair, right? As in D Company, etc. Right? Really well organized, international. And the violence got uglier and uglier, right? So we had automatic weapons, gunfire in the streets of Bombay. That famous shootout at Lokhandwala happened like 3 blocks from my home. My father and I were driving back from town, and we heard the fire echoing off the buildings, right? And then my family's all in the film industry, and my brother-in-law, Vidhu Vinod Chopra, like many other people, got these calls from Dubai, right, saying you need to pay us this much money. And so Vinod and his family lived for a couple of years under armed police guard, right? And people that I knew were being shot at, right? And a couple of people got killed. So I was like, what the hell's happening here? So I asked my friend Hussain Zaidi, the crime journalist, I'm sure you know his work, just like tell me about what's going on and introduce me to anybody who can talk to me about this, right? So he introduced me to people on both sides, the cops, and on the other side, the intelligence agencies I found through somebody else. And, people like not in this world directly, but affected by it, right? Like And then I love being in offices and spaces because I'm always asking questions and writing down the answers. But, I interview a cop in a police station, and years later when I'm trying to write a scene, I'll remember the fancy expensive kids he was wearing under the table, right? And that detail really can make a character, right? So this unconscious picking up, right? And like I like traveling. It's a way to avoid writing again, and taking photographs and listening to people. All of it like goes into this black pit, right? And which bubbles away. A friend of mine, another writer, and I call it the tar pit after the tar pits in Los Angeles, right? So animals have fallen into these pits thousands of years ago, and suddenly a mammoth will float to the surface, right? So you put it all in there, and something happens, and then somebody comes out or an incident comes out.
What I find very striking is that so much of your writing seems to be inspired by trying not to write. But it seems to happen anyway.
Well, I mean, I don't know how it is for you, but writing is really hard and it's painful, right? For a lot of us, right? I have met a couple of people who are happy writers, who love writing. I'm like, you are hateful because I'm jealous of you, right? And if you talk to many writers, you'll find this, I think, across the board, right? So being away from your desk and having an excuse to avoid it is actually fun. And then you're right, you come back, and then you're actually in some sense eager, right, to create out of that.
So we're going to open up for audience questions soon after just one more question, Vikram. So there's some stories about people that you've met that you cannot share, but are there any that you are willing to share?
I mean, so the reason I can't share some of them is that I can't tell you about those without naming the people, and I still feel responsible to them, and some of them will actually put them in danger, right? It sounds very thriller-like and all that stuff, but if you're investigating this world, so I can tell you about my meeting with Arun Gowli, right? He's G Company, he's one of the enemies of Dawood and so forth. So the first time I met him, so it's like, you go and you sit in these white plastic chairs, the universal white plastic chairs, and he lives in this chawl in Bombay near the mill area. And then one of his boys will come down and get you. So it's like a darbar of sorts, right? And you go up, and like his kids were watching television, they're watching cricket, and there's a huge chandelier, right, on the above it. And then when I was taken to meet him, there's a hall kind of thing with lots of mirrors on the wall. So again, like, you see what I'm doing? Is like you get an idea of Bhai aesthetics, right? And sense of place and all of that. And then the incredible thing about him was that years later, when Sacred Games was released, must have been like 12 years later, the Italian publishers had this clever idea of, we're not going to invite you to Italy to do PR. We're going to send a bunch of Italian journalists to Bombay, and you can show them around, right? So my friend Hussein Zaidi and I took them to meet Arun Gowli, and he remembered me, right? Which is, you can see now why somebody like that would be effective in the world that he lives in, and how he would survive for so long and still survive, right?
I have one thing that really struck me was this tweet thread that I think the Paperclip or one of those handles put out the other day, which basically said that there's this tradition in the Mumbai crime world where when a job is offered, like a dish of pan is put out there, and whoever takes the pan is, whoever does the hit or so on is considered to be a particularly brave
Supari.
Soldier. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
What is striking is that
sorry, go on.
It's a Deccan courtly tradition that was
really?
also being done in the 11th, 12th
wow.
century, where a king would offer pan or supari to a vassal, to a general, and it would be a reward and also a promise of future rewards for the work they're doing on the king's behalf. And what really strikes me is how similar the culture of Mumbai's dons seems to be to that of medieval Indian royal families. And it tells you a lot about the nature of I remember there's this little quote from Terry Pratchett where he says something on the lines of, if you're to only steal like a loaf of bread or a few coins, then you're a thief.
Right.
But if you were to steal an entire continent, if you
Yeah.
were to steal an entire kingdom, then you'd be acclaimed as a noble
Yeah,
and
yeah,
a king and
Yeah.
a lord.
Well, I
And,
mean, so we were just talking before this about like what is the word for some, for leaders using all religious traditions, right? All spiritual traditions. So the second time I went to see Gauli, and this was new on his terrace where we met him, you walk in and like it's a multi-religious tradition temple of sorts, right? So there's a big temple of Shiv with water flowing down, right? And then there's a picture of the Kaaba, and then there's a Christian cross, right? So the appeal is multi-religious, right? In exactly the way that rulers do. Right?
Fascinating. On that note, let's get some questions from the audience. Please raise your hands and we'll get you a mic.
How do you not put your opinion into it? Like, how do you not put yourself and put your thoughts into it, just presenting the facts? Doesn't it get a bit boring when you start writing about it?
No, but I do, right? And that politics, your feelings, maybe even your own personal history forms the book, right? And
So you don't feel like an imposter at all?
no, I mean, I think what sometimes stops me when I'm reading fiction is that there's a story going on, and then somebody pops in to tell me what to think about what's going on, right? Although even sometimes that's kind of fun, right? Because layers underneath layers, somebody's telling a story about somebody who tells a story about somebody else.
Right.
Then what you can do with the meta story is have somebody comment on what's going on inside, right? But you've got to do it in a fun, entertaining, fictionally interesting way as well, right? But if you do it in a kind of straightforward thing, like half the pleasure of reading fiction is that don't tell me what to think, right? Let me work out what's going on by myself, right? So therefore the famous dictum, show, don't tell, right? And so you want to show and let the reader figure out what's going on.
Thank you. So I really like the way you talk, the way you write.
I'm sorry, I think we only have time for one question per person.
I just wanted to say you're amazing. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. That's always good to hear. And I should say, if you can tell somebody they're amazing, you always should, right? Because life is short, right? And everybody needs that, especially in our trying times. Yeah.
You came up with about the Supari. I found that very interesting. I think the question is for both of you, because it is a symbol of power and it's a rite of passage, so it's a sort of a tradition in masculinity. Are there any changes you've seen or any interesting new practices in this underworld or in the world of power?
Well, I mean, the thing that comes immediately to mind, I think often, maybe even always, the first person people to use new tech. Some of the first cell phones in Bombay were being used by these guys because you can see why, right? I mean, you can talk to Dubai easily, right? Satellite phones, encryption, right? Blockchain right now, right? If I can pay somebody across the world without tracking, right? And anonymously, how cool is that, right? For shady stuff. So I would say that inventions of language, new reinventions, because the slang that is used, right? So khoka and peti, right? For money, ghoda for pistol, right? And so that kind of stuff keeps on changing, right? And being influenced by other factors outside.
So if I could just add to that, I think that one thing that's particularly striking about the way that political culture has changed while also remaining the same is that medieval kings would try to legitimize themselves by claiming that they're upholding dharma, and so do modern political leaders. And what's also striking to me is that while kings would claim this right to rule based on a closeness to the gods, we somehow seem to have come full circle and do the same thing. So even though we have the modes of, we go through the motions of elections and voting for people, that's important to claim your legitimacy, but the underlying ideas of what grants you the right to rule in India haven't changed. And the way that they're used and misused also has not really changed.
I am under strict orders to keep things on time. I'm so sorry.
Cheers. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you.